Can the French economy be fixed? President Emmanuel Macron tries to do what his predecessors failed: reform employment laws. Are his plans to boost the Eurozone's second largest economy fair? And how can he avoid the collision course with French workers and trade unions? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Ahalbara. On a path of profound transformation, that's the promise of President Emmanuel Macron to reform the jobs market in France. Major proposals have been unveiled, aimed at reviving the second largest economy in the Eurozone. Following years of stagnation, government leaders want to reduce unemployment, limit the power of trade unions, and make it easier for companies to create jobs. Trade union leaders are opposing making it easier to hire and fire workers, and what they say is an attack on employee rights and social welfare. We have lots to discuss, but first, David Chater reports from Paris.
The long-awaited battle has begun. Even before the full details of the reforms were announced, the hardline unions were on the streets. President Macron believes the reforms will set businesses free from a straitjacket, but these demonstrators say they will undermine the basic rights of workers.
We ask that everyone works 32 hours. If we share the number of worked hours, we will manage to create more jobs.
The militant unions and the left wing have accused President Macron of attempting a coup d'etat against social welfare. They say he's not attempting reform, but a revolution. This trial of strength will define the presidency of Mr. Macron. The protest was being held outside the annual conference staged by France's largest employers' federation. A majority of the enterprises they represent are small businesses, hungry to expand, but held back by the 3,000 pages of the country's employment codes. They applaud Macron's attempt to back them and boost employment.
We will only take France out of the hole she's been in with audacity and entrepreneurial spirit. People who want to start their businesses shouldn't be afraid to hire.
It was the French Prime Minister who led the charge of Macron's ministers. The details of the reforms were complex, but the aim was clear.
Our goal is simple. We aim to favour job creation by giving much more security and transparency to entrepreneurs in their hiring decisions, and more guarantees to employees.
But bicycle couriers who deliver food to customers from restaurants in Paris have launched protests this week saying their work has no such guarantees. Self-employed contractors like Uber drivers, they say their British-owned company is exploiting them, and they put their bosses under siege in the French capital.
Bikers only work in the evening, not the whole day, so they only make 300 to 400 euros a month, and they don't have enough to pay the rent.
Back at the Employers' Federation, delegates were getting their stress pummeled out of them at an alfresco massage parlour. President Macron might need their services next month. A wave of protest is about to begin. David Chater, Al Jazeera, Paris.
The unemployment rate in France is higher than the European average. Almost 10% of French workers didn't have a job in July, compared to 3.7% in Germany and almost 5% in the Netherlands. President Macron has vowed to cut the French unemployment rate to 7% by 2022. The French economy has been stagnant for many years and the unemployment rate stubbornly high for decades. Let's have a closer look at the proposed reforms. The government wants to give French firms more flexibility to negotiate wages and conditions rather than binding them to industry-wide rules. A cap on compensation for payouts for wrongful dismissals is also planned. Companies with fewer than 50 employees will be able to negotiate with a staff representative bypassing trade unions. And the reforms will ease restrictions on multinational companies to make French workers redundant. Let's bring in our guests. From Paris via Skype, we have Nicolas Vinocourt, reporter at Politico. In London, Charles Lichfield, a European affairs analyst. And joining us from Brittany in the northwest of France is Jacques Roland, head of European research at the Global Policy Institute. Welcome to Inside Story. Let me start by asking Mr. Nicolas Vinocourt this. Mr. Nicolas, it took the France more than 30 years to have a president willing to do what was unthinkable, change the labor laws. How significant is this move?
Well, I've heard it to be the most significant overhaul of labor rules in the post-war period. I think that's not an exaggeration, because they're changing the basic principle, which is that national standards trump local standards, and this reform turns that on its head and makes the negotiation inside the enterprise trump the national regulation on many, not all issues, and that's a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Lichfield, which of the reforms you consider to be very significant and that might have some far-reaching consequences on the French economy?
Well, my fellow speaker just said very clearly what the main tenet of the reform is, and that is to turn the logic of French labour law on its head and to allow companies to have the flexibility they claim they need to operate in the 21st century. Mm-hmm. My question, I suppose, about this reform is whether they actually embrace that flexibility once it's there. I think all of us will agree that this reform will pass. Mr. Macron has a very large, comfortable majority, and he's using a device to get this through Parliament quickly. But once it is the law, will companies actually embrace this flexibility and negotiate with their employees to use the new flexibility to compete better? I don't know. I think it will be quite a good thing for small and medium enterprises in France. France needs to develop its tissue of small and medium enterprises, but I wonder whether people will take the risk of negotiating with their employees to see if they can actually negotiate on pay, negotiate on overtime, on holidays. All of that is risky in itself.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Roland, the narrative in the past was basically France needs to have some flexibility in its economy. Now, with this new reform, will the new economy bring in more jobs and generate growth?
No, that will not be enough. I mean, this reform will create a better context for employers to be. They will have more visibility, more ability to negotiate at their own level. Therefore, they will be more flexible, more reactive. Mm-hmm. But in order for France to create more jobs, you need to have higher demand, better wages for workers too. And at the same time, this reform of labor legislation is the first step only in the big transformation of the French welfare system, which Emmanuel Macron wants to enact, and especially the fact that transform the funding of the French welfare system also. So that is part of a package of a few reforms which are meant to transform France and make it more able to create jobs, and at the same time change the culture of the French people, mm-hmm. make them more business friendly.
Okay, speaking of the culture itself, Mr. Vinocourt, we're talking about a society that has been reluctant for many decades to sort of embrace a new approach. So basically, we're having this new package that eases restrictions on multinational companies operating in France, giving small companies the right to negotiate agreements with workers without the presence of intervention of unions. Do you think that the French people will be receptive to those new reforms, or they will be a little bit skeptical about their future?
Well, it's difficult to talk about the French people as a whole. What we can say is that they elected a president who promised change and said that he was going to do this. And this man was elected with more than almost 25 million votes. And that's a pretty strong vote of confidence. We have a poll out today showing us that a majority of the French are favorable to these changes. But then, of course, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, and does the reform affect me or my children or my grandchildren, that's where you run into resistance in this country. If the reform doesn't concern you, then no problem. It's unpopular with some trade unions, hardline trade unions, and obviously the far left. Those are the real opponents here. But I don't think we're going to run into massive national resistance to these changes.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Lichfield, this is a president who enjoys a comfortable majority in the parliament. However, his popularity has plummeted over the last few weeks. Do you think that he will be in a better position to implement the reforms, even if people took to the streets in the future?
Well, I mean, I suppose it is concerning, and I think he's reacted. The fact he's lost so much popularity so quickly is something that his team has reacted to, and they've tried to rethink his communication strategy. And it does raise a question, I suppose, if he's lost popularity so quickly on the basis of no particular reform for the moment, it does raise the question about what he can do in the future. Nonetheless, I agree with my fellow panelists that this reform will definitely go through, and that the French seem to be, for the moment, in favour of it. Obviously, with some questions about what actually the effects might be on their own situation. But a penny seems to have dropped in the French psyche about liberalisation. We've said over this programme already many times that for decades France has resisted liberalisation, and Macron's popularity itself, the fact that he arrived pretty much from nowhere as a very young economy minister and managed to put together a proposition that people were willing to vote for, signals that the French, I think, are ready to adapt to the liberalisation that has gone on in other countries, obviously in a French way and with some resistance. But I think this law will go through. The question is whether future reforms do go through. I would simply add that another priority for Macron is bringing the deficit down. To be taken seriously in Europe, and in conversations he will have with Merkel and others on Eurozone reform, he has to make sure that France's deficit is below the 3% limit. It isn't for the moment, and he received a budget from the previous government that was slightly out of kilter. And he needs to decide, I suppose, whether he's going to concentrate on reducing the deficit once this reform is through, or whether he sticks to his reform program and other tax cuts, which would make reducing the deficit difficult.
Mr. Roland, former president failed to win the hearts and minds of unions, and therefore his proposal to reform the labour law backfired. It didn't work. Now the new reform strips some of the powers from the unions. Do you think that that could potentially take most of the unions to the streets and oppose the reforms?
This time, the situation is very different, for the main reason being that first, he had announced his plans during the election campaign, and he was elected with 2/3 of the vote. That's an important factor, while Hollande had not announced his El Khomri measure before he was elected.
Well, let me go to Mr. Wyneke. Mr. Wyneke, there's some mixed reactions now to this reform, some anxiety among some people. Others are really, entrepreneurs are very excited about it. I would like to ask you this. What kind of impact will this reform have on the future of the European economy?
Well, European economy, France is the second biggest economy in the European Union. So if in, let's say, 18 months or 2 years, employment picks up in France, job creation picks up, you'll have the economy growing, and that will provide a significant pull for the Eurozone economy and for the European economy. I think one question we should ask is, what is not quite right with this reform? What has he done here? Does it benefit some people more than others? And I think that is certainly the case. We are liberalizing short-term contracts, which are the main contracts offered to young people, and totally leaving intact the long-term CDI job contract. And that's the ironclad job contract with top-notch job security.
Wyneke, you know that the short-term contracts were abused in the past systems, and therefore the need for an overhaul has to be implemented anytime soon for you to move forward.
They certainly were abused, and I think they were correct to address those abuses and put in place a more realistic system. But what the OECD has pointed out, for example, is that France has an insider-outsider labor system. You either have one of these ironclad job contracts or you're outside the system and you want one. And this reform is not addressing that imbalance. It's not taking away job protections from the people who have very comfortable positions and give them to young people. So it's leaving in place those strong job contracts, which I may add are the bedrock of the French credit system. Because if you want a bank loan, if you want to purchase a house, for example, then you'd better have one of these good job contracts. And you can forget about it if you have a short-term job contract.
Mr. Lichfield, the reforms were started by the Germans or introduced by the Germans in the 90s, and they made German what it is now. Do you think that the new reforms in France would lead to more competitivity in the economic sector in the near future and put an end to the years of anxiety and economic decline?
Well, as Mr. Winokur was saying, these reforms aren't exactly like the Schroeder reforms of the early 2000s. They're certainly not a big bang. They leave quite a lot of the responsibility and the risk to the companies in negotiating whether they use this flexibility or not with their employees. And it's quite difficult to work out whether they actually will. It leaves this huge problem, this huge dichotomy in the French system between the short-term CDD contracts and the CDI contracts. As Mr. Winokur says, there are other sort of associated knock-on effects of having this dichotomy in the French credit system. And I don't think that this will really address them. As our other fellow panelists said, this is only one of several other reforms which Macron will get round to, although his agenda has been delayed a bit by this deficit he inherited from a previous government. And so I'd say wait and see. I think more reforms have to be pushed through for France to really become more competitive, for it, especially its small and medium enterprise ecosystem and its startups to really be as competitive as their European counterparts. And it will take a bit of time. Nonetheless, it is good to see France getting its first flagship reform through.
Mr. Roland, do you think that this reform will put France in a better position to negotiate future economic and financial agreements with the European Union?
It's a necessary step, yes. Obviously, it was quite clear that the Germans would only take the French seriously if they were able to push this reform. But that is a fact. And I will also point out the fact that he will announce some further reforms which should help France make France a bit more competitive.
Winokur, Ronald is talking about the fact that the reforms will be conducive to an attractive environment for international, multinational companies to invest in France. But the reforms, as you said, they are not really what people were expecting, the far-reaching reforms to be implemented. Are these reforms enough to bring about a radical change to the French economy?
This reform in itself is not the be-all, end-all solution, but it is a very significant step, and we should not diminish. This is something that previous governments were unwilling to go this far in addressing the rigidity of the labor market. I would invite the people watching to take the full scope of the reform agenda into account. There's going to be a reform of the unemployment benefit system, which is horribly indebted. And that is a step toward the reforms that Germany put in place, which helped to make the German economy so much more competitive in the early 2000s. Then you have the financing of the welfare system. You have a taxation reform. All these things put together, if he manages to do this in the next 2 to 3 years, France could come out looking very different at the end of Macron's term and much more competitive.
Mr. Lichfield, will the French be able to sort of liberalize their economy with the new reforms?
Well, I mean, as we've all been saying, there's a schedule of reforms coming which, if you take them all together, do suggest that France will be a more liberal, more open economy. But I'd repeat that we need to first look at how Macron works with this agenda. The timeline was supposed to take us from the labor reform straight into a corporate tax cut and further liberalization of the service sector in 2018. And that it's not quite clear for the moment, but the Prime Minister suggested that these would be delayed in order for France to be able to meet its deficit targets. And now Macron has said that these might actually happen in 2018, although he's not quite sure. And so that's one problem which I think that they'll have to deal with. However, all of these reforms do push France in a more liberal direction. That's certain.
Okay, there's this issue of the timetable. Let me go now to Mr. Roland. But also you have this issue of navigating through the very complex political landscape in France, which has forced former president to water down their own labour reforms. Do you have any concerns that Emmanuel Macron might end up watering down also his own version of the labour reform to try to accommodate the concerns of the leftists, the unionists, and those who are very sceptical of any liberalisation of the economic sector?
No, I don't think he will water down. I think that Macron has shown that he is quite a brave politician and ready to face and to challenge sacred cows in France. He's quite ready to challenge a very significant part of the electorate, which most governments tend to handle with care. And he has the same attitude with unions. He's realized that he's managed to divide them, and therefore, and he has, I think, won the battle, the ideological battle that France needs transforming. And it's not just his nomination, his appointment, which made that. The ground was prepared by François Hollande, who, despite of his failures, has obliged some of the left to accept that in France, job creation depends on business, and that you should favor creation before redistribution. So I think the French people are now more ready to accept that the economy needs to be transformed, and especially the biggest challenge that he will face will be transforming the welfare system and making sure that the welfare system is financed more through taxation than through employee and employers' contribution.
Mr. Wyneke, major unions remain divided about this new reform. CGT is saying that it will take to the streets. Others are saying that they are going to be receptive to those reforms. Is this a signal that the French people understand that with the 35-hour week, there's absolutely no way they will be able to move forward and build a strong economy, and therefore they have to make some concessions?
I'm not sure the French people are going to throw up their hands and say we were wrong all along. We had somebody in your introductory piece say that it would be a good idea to have a 32-hour week so we could create more jobs. I think this notion that there is a finite number of hours that can be divided up among the population still exists in the heads of many French people, and those are the people you will see marching in the streets on September 12th and September 23rd. That said, the government has been very clever about playing divide and conquer among the unions. We don't know what they told each other during secret negotiations, but the negotiators received them one by one and handed out probably concessions, probably promises as to their own status and the status of their delegates within the companies, ensuring that unions would continue to have a place in society. So what do we see right now? We see of the 5 major unions that negotiated this deal, only one of them is going out to protest or has said they were going out to protest on September 12th. Then you have the far left led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, which is going to have a separate protest on September 23rd. This means that the unions and the political left are divided. For me, this is not a unified front against this reform, and I don't think we're going to see some kind of society upheaval against this this reform. Along the argument of this is a historical advancement that's being undone. I think the French are tired of this, and they will let it happen.
I see your point. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to all our guests, Nicolas Wyneke, Jacques Roland, and Charles Lichfield. And thank you too for watching You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Al-Bara, and the whole team here. Bye for now.